Okay, so I am tasked with closing out the day, and I do just want to extend a special thanks to Mitch and Eric for a wonderful, wonderful day, and I learned a lot from listening to all the presentations today. I'm really excited to share some of the ongoing work in my lab on depression and suicide in adolescents. And as you'll see, one of the focuses of my work is really to better identify mechanisms that help us understand the onset of depression, but also may inform why certain depressed youth engage in suicidal behaviors. A lot of this work is really framed around the research domain criteria, which, as almost everyone in this room knows, provides dimensions of behavior that strongly map onto the neurobiology of mental illness. And the work in my lab is really oriented around both the positive and the negative valence system, in large part because there is some fairly influential animal work that has shown chronic stress occurring early in development leads to long-term dysfunction in mesolimbic or dopaminergic mesolimbic pathways, which contributes to depressive-like behaviors in animals. Among adolescents, more specifically, it's a period of this heightened reward drive. Davey and colleagues have a series of really influential papers as well, in which they show that adolescents are really goal-seeking, pursuing an array of different rewards, such as complex social relationships, peer status, romantic relationships, and the failure to obtain some of these more complex goals and rewards confers increased vulnerability to depression. Some really beautiful work by B.J. Casey through the years has shown that there's also this discordant development between the prefrontal and limbic pathways that confers vulnerability to depression. In part, adolescents, again, in this goal-seeking vein, are charging towards reward with this kind of intact mesolimbic system, but the tools to modulate said reward, this being the prefrontal cortex, of course, are fairly underdeveloped rather, and again, conferring increased vulnerability to depression and suicidal behaviors. The caveat here is that reward pursuit itself is not maladaptive per se. It's in fact quite normative. But it's the deviations in this reward drive that provide enormous insights into our understanding of depression onset and suicidal behaviors. To that end, my lab has been particularly interested in trying to identify different transdiagnostic factors that may be a gateway towards depression, but more broadly, an array of disorders. You could think of depression as almost a holding cell. A certain percentage of these individuals who develop depression are very, very likely going to go on to develop different disorders, such as bipolar disorders and substance use disorders and thought disorders. And it's really important for us to begin to identify some transdiagnostic factors that differentially predict these different pathways. One such course of action that we've taken is looking at some of the structural data. Prior research in adults has shown that there's two studies actually that reduced volume within the dorsal striatum, most specifically the caudate, showing an inverse relationship such that reduced volume in the caudate is associated with higher levels of anhedonia. But we wanted to actually look at the prospective relationship in the context of adolescence, and we found something pretty interesting. We found that reduced volume in the putamen bilaterally prospectively predicts out higher levels of anhedonia at the 3-month follow-up. And we see this while controlling for baseline levels of depression, anxiety, and anhedonia. Interestingly, we also see that reduced volume in the putamen actually moderates the relationship between subjective response to peer subjective response to peer acceptance and subsequent anhedonia symptoms. Excuse me. We've also been interested in looking at striatal activation in the context of functional tasks. So this is a task that was developed by Greg Hychak, in which he was able to show, sorry, gosh, I'm a little anxious up here. Sorry. In this particular task, Greg was able to show, oh, thank you. This is very unlike me. In this particular task, individuals are presented with two doors, and they're simply asked to choose a door. If they select the correct door, they see a green arrow facing up, meaning they win 50 cents. If they had chosen the other door, they see a red arrow facing down, meaning they lost 25 cents. What we were particularly interested in doing was looking at striatal activation, and what we see is this relatively robust activation in the nucleus accumbens, showing relatively greater activation for wins relative to loss. And we looked at this in the context of otherwise healthy adolescents. And what we're seeing here is pretty interesting. We're seeing that these otherwise healthy individuals, for those who are showing this relatively reduced activation to wins versus loss, are prospectively predicting out higher levels of depressive symptoms at the follow-up, and we're seeing this effect bilaterally. And what's interesting about these data, which are quite preliminary, we're collecting this in the context of low and high risk individuals, and these are high risk owing to parental history of depression. We're actually seeing that the effect is slightly stronger at a statistical trend within the context of the high risk group. What we're also interested in doing, though, is trying to understand the carryover, so using same tasks in different samples to discriminate otherwise like groups. So what we're also doing in the context of another study are comparing depressed suicide ideators and depressed suicide attempters with comparable levels of symptom severity. So these are individuals that have comparable levels of depression severity, anxiety severity, and suicidal ideation. And again, this isn't an electrophysiology study, and we're using the same task, but instead we're focusing on the reward positivity, which is the negative going frontocentral component, and the reward positivity maps very closely onto striatal activity. In fact, Dan Fody and Greg Hychek have done some really exquisite and elegant work that have done this both concurrently with EEG and fMRI, but also separately with EEG and fMRI, showing that the reward positivity is explicitly related to striatal activation. And here, again, we're comparing these like suicide ideators and attempters. And so if I could draw your attention to the top panel here, what we're seeing is amplitude on the y-axis, and this is time on the x-axis. And these are the ideators on the top panel. Win is in green and loss is in red. And you're seeing that these individuals, time locked to feedback, are able to differentiate the feedback. When looking at the attempters, however, there is a failure to actually differentiate this feedback. And we're actually seeing the same results whether we're using a monetary reward task, but in a separate study looking in the context of social reward feedback. Again, the depressed suicide ideators are able to discriminate being accepted and rejected, whereas the attempters are not. So where do we go with this particular research? So my lab has a series of studies looking at an array of biological markers from ERPs to structural to functional to even spectroscopy data, but we're really trying to link this to in vivo affect, trying to understand how these biological indicators are contributing to subjective affective lability using ecological momentary assessment, but also using passive indicators, so things like the accelerometer that's been talked a lot about today, but also passive social indicators, so looking at their social network through their communication logs, the frequency in terms of which they're reaching out to friends, but also the strength and reciprocity of those relationships, to the extent to which they're calling other friends and those friends are calling them. And we're able to track all of this data, and again, to try to be able to link it out to some of our biological indicators of interest across our at-risk groups, across our depressed groups, and our suicidal youth. But I think that this was brought up quite nicely by Joe here today, and a couple other people have alluded to this. What happens, and I think in the context of my data, but I think if we're all being honest in the context of your data too, is that you pick the horse that wins, meaning you run a lot of different analyses in the context of your lab, and some of those hypotheses work out and some of them don't, and those that don't work out go somewhat underreported. And we think we know best, but actually we rarely do. And a different approach might be to use supervised machine learning to really harness the power of the data we're collected, to not assume that we know the independent variables or the collection of independent variables that may lead to the outcome of interest. And so, of course, we're taking more of this univariate and also a multivariate approach, but we're applying these different types of supervised machine learning techniques to discriminate like groups, for example, in the context of high-risk and low-risk youth, or ideators and attempters, and also predicting discrete outcomes, things like depression onset or suicidal attempts, or even predicting treatment response, both in the context of face-to-face therapies, but in a more recent study of ours, looking at it in the context of predicting the heterogeneity of the treatment effect, trying to predict which individuals are likely to respond optimally to online treatments. And as kind of a last-ditch effort here, I came to this meeting 2 years ago, and somewhat shamefully, I don't think that I was able, aside from really enjoying the day and being stimulated by the conversation, I don't think that I really took it upon myself to push it forward in a meaningful way. And I think that in listening to a lot of the talks here today and listening to several of you speak each year, we're collecting so many of the same variables. And I think it's really important for us to kind of push aside our own motivations here and join some of these data together. And I'd like to form a work group that figures out what are we collecting that is the same. You could have your babies and still publish them in top journals, but I think that part of the struggle here is that we have imaging sets of 50 and 70 and 20 and 18, and I think that if we put it all together, there's an opportunity to really better understand factors that influence important outcomes like depression onset, bipolar onset, and even in fact suicidal behaviors. And so for those who are interested in kind of joining forces, and you shouldn't feel pressured, I won't judge you to your face, I'd really love for you to back channel, and I think it would be fun for us to work together on some of these projects that I think could be quite powerful. So thank you.